Hello, welcome back to another episode of Across the River and Into the Books with me, Brandon Booth Jones. Now, I'm very excited about today's video. I've been ruminating on this idea for a little while, and basically, I'm going to read the first 1,000 titles published by Penguin starting in 1935. Now, I got this idea from watching the videos of a YouTuber named Jules Burt, and I'm going to link his channel down below. Highly recommend it. Jules Burt is a passionate collector of many things. Now, I'm not so interested in Star Wars memorabilia, but I like to watch his videos talking about his book collections. Now, he's really a purist. I think he has almost every first edition of almost every book in the first 1,000 series of Penguins, and he's gone on to the next 1,000 and so forth. And Jules Burt does like to read books, but that's not really his focus. It's more about just getting this pure and complete collection. Now, I am a collector in a different sense. I'm not interested in antiquarian or rare or first editions. I certainly don't treat physical copies that I own gingerly. I mark them up with pen and highlighter, and I dog ear the pages. I don't collect books for the sake of monetary value or collector's joy in sort of a pure complete set. I just love books, and I collect them in my head for the endless tunnels and passages of perspective and character and voice and catharsis that I get from reading. Now, in an ideal world, I will one day have a library with, almost every a copy of almost every book that I've read. That would be great, but that's a real luxury, and I'm just more than happy to have them written down so that I know when it's time to return and reread. And if I had to do it via Kindle, then so be it. So my purpose in this series is not to collect the first 1,000 Penguins in first editions, but simply to read that first 1,000 titles. Now, I went through the list, and I was actually surprised that I'd read as many as roughly 50 of these titles. And why I say that is because many of them are out of print, many of the authors are long forgotten, and so yeah, I want to make the series going through those 50 that I've read, but at the same time trying to get my hands on the other 950 and doing intermittent videos where I update that reading journey and also maybe have a bit of fun with sleuthing and sort of trying to locate these through, secondhand farmers markets or, online or, just trying to get my hands on some copy, not for outrageous prices, but just get my hands on this first 1,000 and make videos about that journey. And I very much want this to be an interactive experience. I would love to hear the people's journeys. How many of these 1,000 have you already read? How many do you own? Do you have some early editions? As I said, I'm not so interested in sort of collectability, more in the titles themselves. So yeah, let's dive into it together. Here's a website that I found, penguinfirsteditions.com. I will link all of the stuff down below as well. Now, I don't think this website is affiliated with Penguin, with the publisher itself. I see a picture of Jules Burt's face here and a link to his YouTube channel. So perhaps he made this website. I'm not 100% sure about that, but in any case, he is referenced here. And this website actually has the first 3,000. So, but we're just gonna start off with the first 1,000. So when we come to book number 1 in the series, this was published on the 30th of July 1935. This is Andre Mauroy, Ariel, translated by Ella Darcy. Now, if we go here and say Andre Apparently it's a Shelley romance. Now look at this on Amazon. $62. That is super expensive. Put this one on hold and try and keep a lookout for it online and in markets and secondhand bookshops. So that's part of the fun, of course, and also is the reason why I'm not going to read them in order. So I'm going to instead just read the ones that I have got and discuss them. I'm going to jump around a bit as well. There are books here that are very much out of print. Some of them are really long forgotten. I mean, I also just want to say, like, how incredible it is what Alan Lane, who is the founder of Penguin Books, what an amazing legacy he has, and he gave the joy of reading to so many working people, first in England and then around the world, by having this vision of affordable paperbacks of great works of literature, contemporary and classic. I know that Penguin has become this gigantic multinational corporation, and there's plenty of criticisms to be leveled at the top end of the publishing world, but I'm not going to do that in this video. Or I at least want to just mention how groundbreaking it was what Alan Lane did at that time. You know, so many people were denied access to literature. It was really the domain of the elite dons of Oxford and Cambridge, and he really thrust incredible works of literature into the hands of so many people. So, because today is the introductory episode to reading the first 1000 Penguins, I'm just going to focus on 10 of these first 1000s. Because we are still in the process of moving, my book collection is still in a state of chaos, so I guess it's time for a little update. So, as you can see, more progress is being made. There's still loads of books in Amsterdam, but we are definitely getting closer. This is gonna be my sort of main working shelf, but yeah, there are loads of books all around here. So yeah, and downstairs as well. It's just 10 of the first 1000, and I'm doing them in order. Anyway, let's just get into it. So first up is number 274, and that is a combined two plays by Oscar Wilde, The Importance of Being Earnest and Lady Windermere's Fan. I actually have The Importance of Being Earnest in two places here, and Lady Windermere's Fan is in this collected plays from Penguin Classics. Now, these are both really brilliant, dazzling, and witty Wilde at his best. Now, The Importance of Being Earnest is probably his most famous play, and for good reason, but I think I actually prefer Lady Windermere's Fan. I think it was a very brave plot to write, and he had to get these works passed by the censor, so the English government, had complete power to ban works that were immoral, and Wilde was a very fervent early advocate of personal freedom. He was obviously a closeted homosexual, and as everybody knows, ended up in jail for obscenity or something absurd like that. He also wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol while imprisoned. and his health actually never recovered after that. Tragically, he died not long after being released from prison. But what a brave man, um, to be so committed to his art. And so the importance of being earnest is a social satire, making fun of these dandy upper class aesthetes, or maybe not aesthetes, but these dandy upper class kind of toffee nosed young men and women who could, you know, make some witty remark, but beneath the playful surface there is a kind of almost rapacious social climbing and materialistic callowness. But it's very funny. It's very, very funny. It's, he really knows how to poke fun at these social mores. The importance of being earnest is neatly symmetrical. But Lady Windermere's fan, I think, is even more powerful in its reversal and irreverence and disregard for established sexual politics. The setting is late 19th century, upper class sexual politics, and by that I mean a patriarchal system in which young men and women are married off according to what is the most economically rewarding match and socially rewarding. And women were very powerless in this system, as were younger sons. So daughters were married off very much without, from the control of the father to the control of the husband. But younger brothers also were much worse off because they had a system called primogeniture, in which the eldest born son would inherit everything and the younger sons would have to go off into the army or the navy. But this story is really about a figure named Mrs. Erlynne, and there's quite an important plot twist, and I would say that this Penguin Classics edition, the notes give away so much of of the plot. And if you're rereading it, okay, but if you're reading it for the first time, I would not recommend this edition because, it just gives away the plot, and then you lose some of like the implicit and kind of subtextual tension. But Mrs. Erlynne, what an incredibly powerful figure she is. She is always kind of this almost motionless centerpiece of the stage, in which, and Wilde was very specific in his notes to the director who put this play on once it had passed the censors. He was very specific about where Mrs. Erlynne needed to be, and actually the positioning of all of the characters. And she is always this still centerpiece, and all of the action is kind of swirling around her on her command, and she remains very cool and composed. But there's always this moral question of, is she a bad woman or a good woman? And the subtitle of the play is Lady Windermere's Fan, Story of a Good Woman. And it's just a very powerful portrayal of somebody who takes the moral high ground and shows that women were as capable of acting rationally as any man, and certainly much more than the kind of foppish, dandy, and shallow men characters in this play. Right, so that was a combined 2 plays, and that was number 274 in the first 1000 Penguins. Okay, next up is number 297. Now, I think that potentially my full copy of this book has either gone AWOL or is still kind of in boxes between Amsterdam and Rotterdam. But I have a kind of excerpt of it, and so number 297 was George Orwell Down and Out in Paris and London. And I have this little Penguin 60s little sort of mini pocket edition, which is called Pages from a Scullion's Diary, and it's just an excerpt of that longer work. So it's a bit of a stand-in. Now, Down and Out in Paris and London is a wonderful book. It was Orwell's first published book, and it's based on a period of about 2 years before he was an established writer, where he was a bit footloose and fancy-free. He was a bit sort of trying to find his vocation or to justify himself as a writer to his family. And he goes off on a kind of, sort of proto-gap year of sorts to Paris, and he, along with a friend of his that he meets along the way, they just work grungy menial jobs in Paris hotels in the early 20th century. It's very, very interesting, especially if you've spent time in Paris. I have spent a lot of time in Paris, and these old, faded sort of and grand hotels, you still see them, and there is a kind of moth-eaten former glory to them. But it's all about, and this book, especially the part about Paris, is all about this facade of cleanliness and upper class quality and eloquence, but actually behind the scenes, Orwell actually describes it as a seam of dirt or a vein of dirt running through each of these hotels. He works in a series of hotels. It's a seam of dirt running through in the background, and how the waiters and the kitchen staff, they're just filthy. They're smoking and spitting, and of course there's no personal hygiene, there's no hand washing or hygiene, health and safety protocols. And it's very funny. He grinds away, cleaning dishes and earning very little and scraping along. He talks about him and his friend at some point having so little money that they would buy a loaf of bread and rub garlic into it because garlic was so strong and it left such an aftertaste that it gave you the impression of still being fed or having just eaten even when you were actually hungry. Now, there's a book that I have upstairs. I'm not going to grab it because I just want to keep rolling here, but by Raymond Williams. It's a kind of mini biography of Orwell, and Williams obviously was a Marxist theorist and critic, and he debunks this early work of Orwell in the sense that he says, well, he portrays Down and Out in Paris and London. He portrays himself as really the starving artist trying to make it as a writer and having no money and always on the borderline of destitution, but that actually that is a kind of self-mythology that Orwell created, because in actual fact he had sort of upper middle class family relations who were actually supporting him and sending him money, and and also, that these relations in England that he could fall back on if and when he really got desperate. Now, okay, fair enough. But Orwell could have just stayed in England and had a cushy job through family connections, but he did go to Paris and work in these grungy, grimy hotels. And then the second part of the book is when he goes to London and he hangs out with a lot of homeless people and sleeps in these kind of Red Cross type hostels for the homeless and the destitute, and eats with them and talks to them and walks around with them, hitchhikes with them. He could have just not done those things. So I'm not sure that this criticism of, well, he had this bourgeois background. I mean, he was not upper class, like he was he came from a kind of, intellectual middle class family, and he went out and got his hands dirty and wrote very brilliantly about that. So I think Williams's critique of, like, well, he's not working class enough or something, I mean, it should be about the writing itself, and Orwell did put himself in those situations and learned a lot and wrote about it and conveyed that to his, admittedly, middle class reading audience. But this was then published in the first 1,000 Penguins, as I said, number 297, and that gave this book access to a wider reading public. And I think Orwell played his part in, or at least added his voice to the growing chorus of calls for reform to working conditions. He has another really even better book than this, but it's not very well known. It's called The Road to Wigan Pier, and he goes and spends time with miners in northern England, and sleeps in mining hostels or homestays, and goes down into the mines and eats their bread and margarine. I remember this very vivid image of in which he describes the landlord in this dingy homestay passes him his slice of bread in the morning, bread and margarine, no real butter, and there's like a blackened thumbprint on the margarine on the piece of bread, because the landlord's hands are just so dirty. Now, we could ask the question: is Orwell glamorizing, or is he dramatizing these working class people images, maybe painting them in a sort of pejorative or condescending light? And that's a fair question to ask. But he went in there to raise awareness of these conditions, and that was really needed, because many of these people, the miners, were working in atrocious conditions. There were many mining disasters, and many men lost their lives. And anyone who is contributing to reform, I think, or anyone who contributed to reform in those days, should be commended. And Orwell did not make it, he was not painting sentimental images of the noble working class or something. It was quite raw and on the nose, and like even breaking down their living costs and how much they earn, which was obviously a pittance. So that is 297, Down and Out in Paris and London, and I would recommend reading that. Everybody knows Orwell for Animal Farm, which actually we will come to in this set of 10 books, and of course 1984. But some of his non-fiction stuff is really, really good. Next one I'm going to show you today is Persuasion by Jane Austen. That's number 427 in the Penguin First 1000s. And this is Austen, at least of her mature work, this is probably her shortest novel. I have a Penguin Popular Classics edition, which I think has some echoes of that minimalist style of the first 1000. And I got this for £1 at a charity shop in Sussex a few years ago, and I read at least the second half of this book in one sitting, or one lying, because I was lying in bed on New Year's Eve a couple of years ago in an old country house in England, and it was raining outside, and we were just in the middle of nowhere, and I knew that around the world and in other places people were partying and celebrating, but I was super happy to be super cozy with the love of my life in bed, and reading this book all the way through, and it was just so gripping. And Anne Elliot is, I think, probably my favorite of Austen's characters. I mean, Emma, of course, is vivacious and has this kind of delicious gossipiness and misguided sense of comical, misguided sense of perceptiveness of other people's motives and body language. So Emma is a lot of fun, but I'd say up there for me is Anne Elliot, who is this just good-hearted and perceptive young woman who is thwarted by her vain and snobbish family. And Austen just does such a good job of like building up the narrative tension till almost breaking point. I mean, it's like a page turner, you know, like I just raced through it. You just it's so breathless. You just need that tension to burst. You just need to be released from it, and it's so adroitly done by Austen. And probably if somebody asked me to recommend Jane Austen, of course, Pride and Prejudice is, with good reason, her most famous work. It's a masterpiece, but I think Persuasion flies a little under the radar, and it's in terms of denouement and like that kind of narrative tension ratcheted up to breaking point, and then this just like massive release. I think there are a few better examples of that in this work. The use of letters as a narrative device is very, very smartly done, and yeah, it's just highly recommend Jane Austen's Persuasion. Okay, next is Graham Greene's Brighton Rock, and this was Penguin number 442. Now I've got this massive omnibus of Graham Greene novels, so it's a bit unwieldy. It's not the most comfortable. You could really injure yourself if you drop this on your head while you're lying in bed reading. Nonetheless, Brighton Rock. Now, I think Brighton Rock has such a poignant moment in it, probably in terms of pathos, like this pitiable, like sadness. I think few novels in the English tradition capture this better than Brighton Rock, and I'm referring in particular to a moment where, so there's the main character's name is Pinky, and he's this almost antecedent to Alex from A Clockwork Orange, I think. I'm not sure if anyone would disagree with me. Please let me know if you do disagree. But Pinky, he's this like really razor ragged skinhead thug, and living in Brighton, which is a small seaside city in the south of England. And he runs this gang, you know, this group of young hooligans who do they service the underbelly of the gangster world in Brighton. And at some point, and I'm not going to spoil this, but at some point he sort of inadvertently ends up marrying this young poor waitress, and she's very innocent. She doesn't know much about life, and she doesn't really see Pinky's true malevolence. But she's like, okay, wow, someone's taken an interest in me, and we're gonna get married, and this like is gonna change things. And they're like, you know, he like rushes through this wedding service, you know, just like as quickly as possible, getting the documents signed. And then he's like, okay, you know what? We're going to the beachfront, and you know, it's your wedding day, so you know, you can just like I'll buy you something. Just choose something. And she's like, okay, well, I guess I would like a stick of Brighton Rock. And Brighton Rock is just this cheap candy, this confectionery of kind of like glazed sugar. And they go into the market stalls, and he just like buys her this stick of candy, and she just stands there like eating a stick of candy, and like that's her wedding gift. And for me, that like struck me so hard. It was so devastating, so heartbreaking. Like that you have this what should be such a special moment, and just the pathos, just like this young, lost, innocent girl, not even 18 yet. I think she was like 16 or something, like standing there, like sort of forlornly, like eating this candy. Very brutal. Now, it's a very interesting book, but my criticism of it is that Pinky is just like not like a real. He's not a rounded character. He is just so brutalized and savage and heartless and cold-blooded, and he's like 17. So I know that there probably are people who grow up in a kind of gang world, and Pinky's background is kind of alluded to, that he wasn't loved and maybe he was in some kind of orphan situation. It's not addressed directly, but still, it's when you have a character that is so unsympathetically drawn, you feel like it's not quite deep or rounded enough. But Greene, I think Brighton Rock is about his fourth or fifth novel, and he was grappling with a lot of guilt and a sort of a shift from atheism to Catholicism. His first wife was Catholic, and he converted to Catholicism. And this stage of his life he addresses in a book called A Sort of Life, which is a kind of memoir that he wrote, and it's really not his best work. I was quite frustrated by that book, but I'm sure I'll discuss it in another video. But nonetheless, Brighton Rock, in terms of his kind of early output, you see him grappling with this theme of guilt and remorse and responsibility in a very sort of sumptuously heavy and dark Catholic sense. So it's an interesting work. It's an interesting work. So that's Brighton Rock by Greene. Next is number 481, Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. Now I recently made a video going in depth on 10 Virginia Woolf books, and I mentioned A Room of One's Own in that video, but I couldn't find my copy, and I still can't. But this is my partner's copy. So I've already mentioned this book, but I think it's fantastic that it was published in the Penguin First 1000. It's a very fierce polemic against this patriarchal system that denied women the right to live their own lives and have their own careers, and especially from the position of intellectual or writer, that they were not allowed to be at Cambridge and Oxford, or if when they eventually were allowed to be there, it was like these really, they were so condescended to, and they were not given equal footing. And how could anyone in such a context emerge as, you know, a brilliant thinker and intellectual when they're continually squashed and disadvantaged and suppressed? And, you know, there's a long philosophical tradition of writers or thinkers sitting at their desk and just describing the objects around them. And famously, you know, chairs and tables recur a lot. You can think of Descartes sitting in his room in Amsterdam, describing you know, the melting wax and his fireplace and his writing papers, and then the phenomenologists also came along and described a desk. You know, Heidegger and Husserl. You know, if you look at a writing desk from all angles, you know, what do you see, and how we know that that object is what is called a desk, even though it's made of atoms and bits of wood fashioned into you know, a piece of furniture. that's a whole discussion for another day. But the theorist Sarah Ahmed, she has a book called Queer Phenomenology, in which she reconfigures these images of, you know, the thinker at the desk, and she says, well, here's a thinker sitting at his desk and he's thinking and writing, but he's not doing laundry, he's not cooking, he's not in the kitchen, and therefore he's not describing those objects. And that somebody who was in the kitchen would be, you know, more perceptive, more aware of the people serving him, providing his meals, cleaning his underpants, looking after his children. And while Ahmed has her work, you know, in the 21st century, or she writes it in the 21st century, but I think Woolf's A Room of One's Own is an interesting forerunner to that reconfiguration of objects, because while she doesn't shift the focus to the kitchen, she takes the woman who's in the kitchen or in the nursery looking after the kids and places her in this room of one's own, and how important that is for intellectual life. But it does also raise questions of class and privilege. Can only, you know, is writing and thinking only available to people who have, you know, a book-lined study in which to be, you know, immerse themselves in solitude. Anyway, I've talked about this book already, so I'm going to move on, but it's number 481. Next is number 524. It's Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Well, what can you say about this book? There's been so much said. It's a fever dream. It's a glimmering, trembling, shivering, nightmarish incantation. Cathy and Heathcliff are just these interwoven energies, forces that are entangled in a destructive downward spiral. It's really, really repays rereading. I reread it not too long ago. And, you know, Brontë was really young when she wrote this, and tragically she died not long after writing it. Who can imagine what astounding work she would have gone on to write if she had lived longer. But she spent her childhood with her sisters and her brother, ranging over the Yorkshire Downs, you know, these desolate, wind-blown, wind-swept, rain-swept fields and meadows and hills, and you really, that atmosphere is so central, that kind of godforsaken, grey, drizzly, howling desolation is really imbued in this novel beautifully and shockingly by Brontë. It's very gothic, it's very haunted, and it's just a masterpiece. Okay, now this is really something completely different, although I must say even more haunting in a certain sense. And this is number 603 in the Penguin First 1000s. It's Hiroshima by John Hersey. Hersey was a journalist, but with a real literary bent, and he went to Hiroshima not long after the atom bomb had been dropped, and he sort of relives the experience through the eyes of Hiroshima residents, about 6 residents, and they have this kind of overlapping, interwoven narrative that is connected through this absolutely horrific, unimaginably devastating bomb that was dropped by the American forces. And it's very gut-wrenching, it's very, very visceral, it is very violent and shocking. It's appalling, it's really, really appalling. But it's good that he did that, because this was then, sold to an American reading public as well as an English reading public with the first 1000s. And it's a short but cataclysmically shaking and destabilizing work, a very eye-opening and sobering work of reportage. Next is actually probably not the first edition, but definitely, oh no way, this is actually a first edition. I didn't even realize. So I do actually have a first edition from the Penguin 1000, and this is number 759. You can see it there. Maybe I can actually open it here. I've had this book for years, and I had no idea that it was first edition, 1950. And this is Selected Letters of D.H. Lawrence. Now, a friend of mine, Ruben at To Readers It May Concern, has just done a very thought-provoking, fascinating, and in-depth video on biography and letters and journals, and I'm going to link his video below because it's really worth checking out. And he talks about this question of, a compendium of just the complete letters or complete journals versus selection. And he makes a very good point in which he says that with selected letters, you have to put a lot of trust in the editor of that collection because they have real power over what is, of course, included or excluded. And the only way to know that, the only way to judge it really, I suppose, is to either read, a lot of biographies of the person in question, or to have read the complete gigantic tome of complete letters. I'm not even sure if that exists for Lawrence, although I think there is like a 7-volume collected letters. But this is Selected Letters, first edition. Little did we know it, in this kind of purplish cover. And this is really a fun read. Now, I think Lawrence is at his best when he's just like outraged and petulant and annoyed and flustered, and he is just like whinging and whining. It's really, really funny. Of course, he's not trying to be funny, but it's just really comical, to look back and see like these small, the minutiae or the small quibbles over, agents' fees or royalties, or because he was always traveling, like trying to get his hands on books to read and really putting friends under quite a lot of pressure to send him, probably quite expensive newly published volumes to Mexico or Australia or Sri Lanka or wherever he was. It's very, very interesting, and reading Lawrence is quite a slog, I find these days, like reading his fiction. But these letters are really raw and glittering, and they show his unmistakable genius in a kind of unfiltered way. Well, though they are filtered because they've been selected, but it's a good selection. And there's an introduction by Aldous Huxley in this edition, and I can also recommend Jeff Dyer has an amazing kind of experimental biography of Lawrence called Out of Sheer Rage. It's an absolute hoot. It's so funny and so much fun, and they're a good match, Jeff Dyer and D.H. Lawrence. And Dyer tries to reread all of his novels, but he just gets so bored, he finds them so tedious, and then he just gets completely addicted to reading Lawrence's letters, and he really identifies this kind of impetuous, almost volcanic energy that Lawrence has, and how that is injected into his sentences into his prose, into his poems too, and into his famous novels. Highly recommend this, and I had no idea that this was a first edition, so great. Okay, two more. Virginia Woolf, Between the Acts. Now, this was number 896, so getting quite close to the end of the first 1000. And I mentioned this also in my Virginia Woolf video, if you're interested to check that out. But one thing I wanted to add that I felt like I didn't quite articulate very well in that video is the framing of this book. The fact that this novel is set on the eve of World War II. And there's this small gathering of country folk getting together to put on a pageant, a village pageant. It's summer, they're in the English countryside, there is something idyllic, but the wider context and therefore the subtext of this work was the war, and I think that it adds a very sharp contrast to the kind of halcyon glow of this ancient English tradition of getting together to do a village pageant. It shows it to be very fragile and valuable, and it's like this glowing ember in surrounding gloom and darkness of the impending war. And I think that adds this book, it really piques this book with sharpness and an immense sense of trepidation, and the fact that Woolf actually took her own life before this book was published, and that she was struggling mentally with the approaching onset of war, and the fact that her that some of her dearest friends and family were killed in the First World War. It just adds a real sense of tragedy to this book, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't read it. It's a very interesting work, and it's got that whole play. It's got like a play within a novel, which also adds another layering, which Woolf always was a master at layering and weaving a kind of tapestry of elements together into a work of fiction. All right, now the last one that I'm going to talk about today is Animal Farm by George Orwell. This was number 838. I have a really tatty edition with like a really old and faded parking ticket between the pages, and yeah, I reread this a few years ago. I don't really need to say too much about it. Everybody has to read Animal Farm at school. I did too, but I would recommend rereading it. I think that I think that this work has stood the test of time, because yes, it is an allegory, but it also is quite witty and poignant, and there's of course the unforgettable image of pigs kind of becoming indecipherable from the masters that they had replaced, and that was a very foreboding tone to end the work on, and I think it's a warning to any epoch to beware of the corrupting nature of power. So that was 10 of the first 1000 penguins. I am going to continue with my research to try and get my hands on some more of them. So there's this Dutch app called Marketplaats. It's a bit like the Dutch version of eBay. I went on there and actually found some quite reasonably priced first 1000 penguins, and possibly even first editions. Not that that's so important to me, but I think some of these definitely are out of print, and it turns out that these 4 or 5 that I found and saved are actually from the same seller. So, and the seller is actually quite close, is based quite close to where we live. So I'm going to message them and see if I can, yeah, maybe strike up a bit of a deal. And in the next video, I will go through another 10 of the first 1,000 penguins that I already own. But yeah, thanks very much for watching, and let me know if you enjoyed this as a sort of series, and yeah, look forward to seeing you again soon.